Russian drone attacks have destroyed the Ukrainian town of Bakhmut, leaving millions without power, according to President Zelensky. The energy facilities in Bakhmut's Odessa province are reportedly destroyed. About 1.5 million people were left without power after the attack. President Zelensky has described the Donbass city of Bakhmut as burnt ruins. And previously, the US has been more wary of attacking Russia, especially with US-supplied weapons, over fears the Kremlin would escalate with tactical nuclear weapons or by targeting neighbouring NATO nations. But according to The Times, since Russia's relentless attacks against Ukraine's civilians, Washington is now less concerned, representing a significant development in the 9-month war. Joining me now is Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Good to see you, Malcolm. So what are you seeing? Is the US less concerned about Ukraine using long-range weaponry to target Russian targets because of Russia's attacks on civilians?
Look, I think the US is very conscious of the fact that the Russians are trying to generate an artificial pause in the conflict to enable them to rebuild their forces in anticipation of launching renewed offensives on a much larger scale in 2023. So the last thing the Americans and the Ukrainians want is for the Russians to suddenly turn the tide and gain the initiative. So I think that there's a recognition that the US has to assist Ukraine now with longer range strike capabilities in order to forestall that possibility that suddenly the Russians could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat next year.
Really? Do you really think that if they were given the opportunity that they could regroup and form a massive offensive, considering all that we've seen in Ukraine?
That's their intention. Now, whether it succeeds is quite another thing. But certainly that's their intention in terms of trying to rebuild their forces so that they can launch counteroffensives and maybe regain the initiative. And so the worst thing we could do would be to give them that open time, that freedom to rebuild those forces and to launch those attacks. And one of the ways we can do that, of course, to prevent that is attacking them directly on the battlefields in Ukraine. And I think that's what the Ukrainians are doing around Bakhmut and in the south around Kherson. But the other way is to hit them in the rear logistics area. And that's where those long-range missiles come in terms of attacks on Russia itself.
So if we do see a rapid escalation in long-range drone attacks on Russian soil, does this mean it's the beginning of the end of the war? Is it that significant?
I don't think so. I think that it's more likely this war will drag on for some time. Certainly the Russians are building up their ability to launch long-range attacks, not only in terms of constructing Iranian drones on Russian soil in new factories, but also seeking to acquire Iranian and North Korean ballistic missiles. So the Russians are in a race to build up their long-range strike capabilities. Now the Americans are helping the Ukrainians respond, and I think that's a very good thing. Obviously, there is still a risk that if the Ukrainians continue to win victories, particularly in terms of taking Crimea, the Russians could then return to the threat of nuclear escalation. And Putin has been rattling nuclear sabers in recent days again. So I don't think we should dismiss that prospect entirely, but I think it's critical to prevent Russia from suddenly regaining momentum, even at the tactical level, because that could actually be devastating for the Ukrainians after all this time.
Attacks on Russia would be a massive psychological blow for President Putin. It would surely weaken his leadership because he's been telling his citizens that his special military operation has been going well. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think you're correct. I think that the additional potential for long-range Ukrainian attacks, whether it's done by long-range drones or if the Americans provide the long-range ATACMS missiles to the Ukrainians to launch off HIMARS, would be a significant blow to Putin. I think the greater blow probably would be losing Crimea. And that's where I think the risk of tactical nuclear weapons use is greatest. But even with these conventional attacks on Russian targets deep inside Russia, I think that is a blow. It just certainly does undermine Putin to a degree, but the risk is that if Putin were replaced, we will get someone worse than Putin in charge. There's no sign whatsoever that you have some sort of pro-Western reformist waiting in the wings to de-escalate the war.
Now, according to The Times, in private, President Putin and his henchmen have been making plans in case they have to flee under a project codenamed Noah's Ark. Where could Putin realistically go if this all turns pear-shaped in Russia for him?
Look, it has an echo of history, doesn't it, in terms of the Nazis fleeing to South America at the end of the Second World War and the boys from Brazil. You know, the same thing could happen here. The talk is of Venezuela as a possible location where Putin is thinking of relocating. Whether he would be allowed to relocate is uncertain. But, you know, I think that Putin realizes that, you know, if he doesn't somehow win, then he personally will be at risk in terms of his end of his life. So he would not quite naturally seek to avoid that. He's got two options, I think, to either flee the scene and go down to South America or somehow escalate the conflict in a way that basically makes it's a much larger war. And I think that's what probably most people are worried about, is that risk of a larger war between Russia and NATO, or the potential for use of tactical nuclear weapons.
Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst at the Strategic Policy Institute. Thanks so much for joining us once again. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend.